We're going to start with a short film and an explanation of the film. Then I will tell you what the exam question is. I will introduce the panel who will answer the exam question, but with your help. And I hope we can use at least half the session for contributions and a conversation. And when we do that, I will ask you not to ask a question, but to say something. So to stand up, give us your name, make a contribution to the conversation, and sit down again. And we have a number of people on the front row who will be already identified as potential people to make a contribution. But I hope everybody will want to own this session and help us reach some conclusions. But before I tell you what the question is, let's have a look at the film that's been provided. Very good. And now Lolita Chamayar, who is part of the company that made the film, is going to come and tell us something about it. Lolita, where are you?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. To give you some detail about this project called Women. So this is a project who will give a voice to women on an unprecedented scale of 3,000 interviews done in more than 50 countries in order to understand what is it to be a woman today, and also what place women could have in the world of tomorrow. But instead of going to expert or statistic, Yann and Anastasia, who are the co-director of the film, have chosen to give a voice to women that we never heard, to women who are not in the light, but who are changing the life of their family, of their villages, of their community. And also with all this everyday hero, the film will also give a voice to some symbolic figures such as Michelle Obama or the first woman president of Ireland, Marion Robinson, in order to show what women are able to achieve when they are given the opportunity. The film will have no voiceover, as you can see on the trailer. It's the women themselves that speak for their life. And we will go through different topics such as childhood, teenage years, marriage, education, empowerment through works, but also more intimate questions such as femininity, the relation of women with their body, sexuality, to summarize all the very small and big subjects of a woman's life. The film will be released in May 2019, but in addition to a classic distribution, we also wish to distribute the film thanks to the support of all the NGOs working on the women's rights all around the world. And empowering women from the very young age is one of the key topics of women's film. In thousands of interviews we have done worldwide, giving access to education for the girls is clearly one of the key solutions to achieving this.
Good. Thank you very much. Round of applause for that, I think. I feel especially sorry for the woman who said she was lonely. I feel she should have come to our session, and then she would have felt supported. Amplifying girls' and women's voices in the global movement for gender equality. There are some important conclusions. We are not going to find ourselves at the end of the meeting, only then just arriving to. So, does anybody think that gender equality is still in need of a struggle? Hands up if you agree with that. Very good. You'd be very brave to disagree. Hand up if you think that amplifying girls' and women's voices is not part of the solution. Put your hands up if you think it's not part of the solution. Nobody puts their hands up, so we agree. So the conclusion of the session is not gender equality is important and girls' and women's voices are important. The conclusion of the session is, what are we going to do about it? And I think there are 2 or 3 things we might want to think about in this session. The first is, what do we mean by voice, actually? Is voice just speaking, or is voice about being listened to, about having your ideas acted on? Perhaps the panel can help us think, what do we mean by voice? It's not just a sort of empty term, it has concrete meaning. And then the second thing is, if we want to amplify women's active ownership and voice in policy making, is this something that is given from the top, or is it something that is taken from the bottom? Is it seized by women and girls, or is it something that they just wait to be offered like crumbs from the table? And what combination of top-down and bottom-up action is necessary in order to achieve the kind of change that we think we want to see? So that's what I hope the panel and the other speakers will help us with. And we have a panel who represent very different perspectives on this. First, we have Sophia Pierre-Antoine, who's from Haiti and runs a network of activist women's organizations. Stavros Lambrinidis, who is the EU Special Representative for Human Rights. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, who is the head of UN Women. And I should say that Phumzile has to leave at 6:30 and will be replaced by Michele Ribotta, who is down here. I hope we will have the occasion to applaud you on the way out, but we might be just in the middle of something, so please don't be offended if we get that slightly wrong. Anna Birgitte Albrechtsen, who is known as AB, who is the CEO of Plan International, and our young leader for this event, who's Ola Abagun from Nigeria, who also brings a special interest in activist women's work. And we have various people speaking from the floor, who I will introduce a little bit later on. But let's start by having a quick perspective. I've asked them all to speak for 2 or 3 minutes only, just to kick off the conversation on this question of what is voice, how do we amplify it, is it given, is it seized? And I'm going to go along the row. You have the first voice.
Okay, thank you. Just to start, I do want to say thank you for having Frida in this space here. Oh, wait. Ooh. Okay, maybe not like this. Okay. Right, so I'm here to represent the Frida Feminist Fund. Frida Fund is the only and the biggest youth-led, young feminist-led fund around the world. And we fund young women, girls, and trans youth globally who are feminists and who are doing feminist work. So by virtue of being Frida, we are innovative, and we give voice to those who usually don't have access to funds because they're seen as small organizations. So to bring it to the voice, it's really about, for us, it's really about empowering the young feminist activists who are already doing such incredible work on the ground, but who don't have the funds and the visibility, and making sure that we can give that to them.
Okay, and what are they doing on the ground, though? Are they marching in the streets, or are they working in clinics, or are they doing political work? I mean, talk a little bit about what it means to be a woman's activist.
They're doing literally everything. You know, the feminist activists, the young women and the trans youth that we support globally, they do whatever they seem best for their community. So sometimes that means advocating, for a law. We had a group that was fighting a law in Lebanon that forced the rapist to marry the girl, as opposed to, going to prison and suffering the consequences. So we have that advocacy. We have some groups who do art festivals. We have groups who do online campaigns about bodily autonomy. We have groups who are engaging religious leaders to change the social norms around forced marriage, like child forced marriage. So really, the point is to say that feminists are involved in everything, and we're absolutely everywhere, but we just need the voice and the funds, so that's what we aim to do.
So amplifying women's voices can happen if it's funded, really, is an important part. And one of these reports is yours, is that right? Is that you, Brave, Creative, Resilient? Yes,
so the report with the awesome picture was made by Frida and also AWID, the Association for Women's Rights Defenders. It's called Brave, Creative, and Resilient. And it was published in 2016. I really strongly encourage you all to check it out. There's some quite shocking statistics from it. I'll just highlight a few very quickly because I really want you to check it out. It's quite short. We found with AWID that of all the groups that we surveyed, so the young feminist groups, half of them were operating with a budget of less than $5,000 per year. So you have all of this amazing work that I mentioned in less than $5,000 a year, and a quarter of them had less than 500. So I really hope today that we can also talk about the importance of funding the ones who are actually leading the social movements on the ground.
Very good. And there are two other reports that you'll see on the PowerPoint. One is by Plan International, which AB will talk about. And I'm sure we'll hear from Zile about the UN one, Turning Promises into Action. But first, Stavros.
Thanks. What is a voice, you asked? I would say, and what makes it powerful, what are prerequisites, I suppose. First of all, of course, you need the right to be able to express yourself, to say what's on your mind, and to, I think you correctly put it, act what's on your mind. Freedom to speak is not simply using the words, it's also being an activist, doing a whole host of things. Now there's some fundamental things that we need to have in place, including laws. You need to have freedom of expression laws that allow to men and women to be able to speak, freedom of association, all those boring things that we take for granted because they've been enshrined in all these international treaties. They're being abused every day in virtually every corner of the world in a way that primarily and very often target women because there is a mentality often that diminishes the importance of what a woman has to say. That's not a legal issue, it's a mentality issue. That has to be addressed as well. Now, how do you make that voice more powerful? Think about what you need to do that. You need to educate girls. It's one thing to say that I have a voice, but you have to ensure that educated girls then, by definition, become empowered girls and become empowered women, and they can change entirely the balance of power of any society through their words, through their voice, whether it is a word or an action. So, educate. I've always said, sometimes in my job people tell me, look at, don't talk about human rights. Don't talk about women's rights. That's too soft. That's too romantic. We live in a tough world here. We're trying to fight terrorists. We need security. We need development. And what I often tell them is, okay, if that's the case, if women's rights is so irrelevant to your hard goals, can you tell me why Boko Haram abducted 300 girls from school instead of bombing one more army barracks? Can you tell me why the Taliban planted a bullet in Malala Yousafzai's head, who was advocating for girls' education? Can you tell me why Nadia and Lamila, the two Yazidi girls in Iraq, were enslaved among so many other Yazidis and forcefully married and raped? What's so scary about smart girls? Why do terrorists target them? And if you think about it, it is precisely the empowerment that education and intelligence gives women that the terrorists hate the most, because they hate the most empowered societies. They want societies with empty black holes of power that they can fill in with the hatred. So, you want to fight terrorists, you want to do hard foreign policy, you want to be a tough politician, educate girls. Don't tell me it's a luxury, don't tell me it's irrelevant. That's how you get that voice strong and powerful.
Very good. I want to ask you more about that, but I'm going to pause because I know Zile has to leave and I want to make sure she gets her time before, so over to you.
Yeah, well, I think from where we sit as the United Nations, we facilitate the audibility of women's voices by using our convening power, bringing women into spaces where they are able to speak truth to power. Because we are an intergovernmental body where they come to speak. In some cases, they're able to speak to heads of states, to speak to ministers, to speak to different types of decision makers, including decision makers in the UN, something that they might never be able to do in their own country. They're able to come and do it in the venues and spaces that we create for them. But also, publications are important because we're able to gather views of women. This is one of them, Turning Promises into Action, which tells the stories of women in the process of implementing the SDGs, what is actually happening to women. And we conclude in this report that what we are doing in implementing the SDGs is too slow and too little So we need acceleration and scale. Otherwise, there's risk that we might entrench rather than overcome poverty. And the women who are affected by poverty would not be able in a coherent way to bring this message in a manner that forces policy changes to happen. So we also facilitate women's participation in politics to become leaders, as well as young women to be visible in spaces where they wouldn't be visible.
What's so interesting about that is that Stavros talked about the importance of educating, empowering girls. He didn't say much about the legal framework of human rights, which I wanted to come back to him and ask about, but the same question really applies to you. If you empower these girls and you educate them and you help them to participate in politics in a society in which the mindset is against them, the space for civil society is shrinking, and the legal frameworks which are available are not being used, don't you find yourself banging your head against a brick wall?
Yeah, that is why movement building is important, because you do need women to speak for themselves, to fight against this pushback that we're experiencing. For us, that includes supporting women to be a coherent group in their own parliaments, in Senegal, in Pakistan, in India. We have supported women to come in Kenya, to come in large numbers to run for office so that they can change the laws, because being a member of parliament is being a lawmaker. You can do something about that. But also in addition to that, we are able to partner with everyone here, especially civil society, to agitate, argue about these laws and the importance of making sure that we pass or we amend the laws so that they are able to address the issue of women, as well as norms and the stereotypes that are more resilient than the laws. You can pass a good law and leave a bad norm. The norm will outshine the law. So you need to do both the laws and the norms.
Very good. It's exactly, no, we've got
I feel like Cinderella.
5 minutes. Let's just see whether, do you mind just hanging on a second as she has to leave? Is there anybody in the audience who would like to say one thing to Phumzile and UN Women before she leaves? Either a story or an experience or a key message of what you'd like UN Women to do in the future. This is your opportunity.
Going once?
Yes, please. There's some microphones, I think. Will you stand up and say who you are before you speak?
Hi, I'm Poppy. I'm from Age International. So my request to UN Women would be, please don't forget about the older women too in the discussions on girls' and women's voices and how we amplify them.
Yeah.
My request would be, they're doing it already to some extent, is educate men. Not just girls, boys. Unless you get them on board, we all know this, it sounds like a trite, but it's absolutely true. We've lost the battle. We've got to change their mindsets as well.
Totally agree.
Very good. Anybody else want to come in quickly before we move on? Yes, there's one more over there. Is the microphone circulating? Thank you.
There's one in the back there.
Hello, my name is Christina. I'm from Romania. I'm co-founder of an NGO named Smartastic Lab, and we think it's very important to emphasize that gender equality and education is based on primary education, early years education, and it starts all from rule of law. And that's what we are doing in Romania. We are trying to educate girls and boys to learn their rights and to respect and understand what rule of law means, because this is what a community will look like and gender equality will develop in a normal situation.
Very good. Did somebody say there was somebody at the back? Oh yes, over here.
Merci. Moi, c'est Fatima Mourdou.
Fatima Mourdou, I'm the head in the Morocco department. If you're speaking in, there is interpretation. I do apologize, my English is not very good, says the speaker. There is interpretation. Since the Well, I've been here since this morning, listening into discussions, and we've been talking about all the problems linked to the inequalities between men and women, and we have forgotten to deal with issues of, well, we deal with becoming autonomous, education, economic issues, stereotypes, sociocultural elements, but we have to talk about the patriarchal structures. They are the total foundation of the whole of this problem. They underpin this whole problem. In your excellent experiment there, what you presented on the screen where you gave the voice to women, it's excellent to give a voice to women, but you must talk to the women and talk about all this from the societal point of view. We're talking about the patriarchal system, which is throughout all of the world in different levels, be you in underdeveloped countries, developed countries, or even the most evolved countries. There's always a patriarchal structure. Now, I'm turning to you as women. How do you deal with this element, this determining factor? It's there, and it really is at the heart of the matter. It's something which means that all those elements that counter the dignity of women are dealt with by this. Thank you.
All the time in these gender sessions that unless you tackle the underlying structures of patriarchy, you can't make progress on all the specific things like education or health or women's empowerment. And it's really about power structures and not about technical interventions. Do you have an answer to that?
Well, I agree. we have to address the underlying structures. And patriarchy is very resilient. So dismantling patriarchy is probably one of the biggest challenges. That is why you need men to participate, because they need to be part and parcel of dismantling patriarchy. But I also want to emphasize the importance of making sure that men and women of all ages work to ensure that we change the way we socialize the children at a very young age. I think one of the questions was about starting early, because already at the age of 6, gender prejudice is already strong. Girls begin to feel they are inferior to boys. Boys begin to feel they are superior. So it's never too early to start. I think I will end it there.
Thank you. And now you have to leave, I know, so we give you a round of applause. And we thank you for making the time. And
can I jump in to this just for a second?
Yeah.
It's not an either or. What concerns me very often is that we focus very rightfully on the underlying problem. But guess what? Changing mentalities of whole societies that are there for centuries takes a very long time. I'm not going to wait for that to happen before I actually build decent schools for girls. And I'm not going to wait for that to happen before I pass laws that ensure that a husband who beats up his wife gets arrested and tried. So you need the laws, you need to work the mentality, no question about it. But don't allow that to paralyze the difficult work of building step by step the institutions you need today that change the power structure.
I think that we're going to hear a little bit about that from AB, because you also have a report on this topic and you've been working in some countries doing some survey work, so tell us about that.
So fundamentally what has happened, first of all, just a few words about PLAN. So PLAN International has existed for 80 years. We've been doing development programs, interventions, small scale, large scale, in over 80 countries in the world. And we've come to realize that exactly the patriarchy, exactly the structural systems, exactly the norms and beliefs that still exists are the ones that make our programs less effective. So we've basically set out on a journey ourselves of shifting everything we do in development to actually address those root causes. Completely agree with you. We're still working on girls' education, still working on a number of things that we've always done, but we've said we will not make the dent. We will not move the needle on the SDGs. We will not reach gender equality if we're not all deeply committed to busting biases, tearing down patriarchy, shifting power. It has to happen, otherwise it won't take place. What does that mean for a fairly old, patriarchal, hierarchical organization with 10,000 employees all over the world? It means that we have to completely rethink how we do it. And the main piece is about putting the girl child at the center and giving her voice and agency within our organization, making sure that she leads. So as we started this transformation, we asked the girls we work with, what can we do for you? What's the difference we can make? And so we asked girls in 40 countries around the world, what's the best thing we can do for you? And they said, build us up. It's education, but it's also more than that. It's protect us, help us with the digital skills that are necessary to be active on social media. It's about building the health and resilience to be an activist, because that's damn hard, especially when you're a young girl that isn't normally heard or seen or expected to be heard or seen. So that kind of growth. But the other thing they said is, so build us up, let us lead, but the real thing you can do for us is help pave the way for a pathway for us to be heard, to put girls and policymakers in the same room. I attended a fantastic session in Kampala just last month, where we took the entire city council of Kampala and hundreds of young girls into the same room and basically let the girls tell their story about how they can't go to the bathrooms until it's after midnight, when the men have drunk themselves senseless and don't go to the bathroom, because that's the only time of the night where it's safe. They told very specific, explicit stories in front of a largely male set of local councillors. When we left that space, every single councillor in that room was firmly committed to making a change. So when we talk about voice and agency and belief, it really is about building up, getting out of the way, paving and facilitating a conversation.
It kind of sounds almost too easy. You know, well, on the one hand, we've got to overthrow the patriarchy, and we've got to rewrite human rights law, and we've got to tackle deep structures of power in societies. On the other hand, we're going to put girls in a room with councillors in Kampala or a number of other things you've all suggested, and suddenly everything will be fine. I mean, I don't know, perhaps I'm too cynical.
You know, I hear you, and it's obviously not easy. But some of this hasn't been done before. I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but the sheer fact that a 16-year-old girl has voice, is articulate, gets access to being in that room with councillors, is shifting minds and beliefs of men, women, that never thought that actually a 16-year-old girl should be seen or heard in that particular space. I'm not saying it's the only thing, millions of other things, but voice and power mean something, because breaking down patriarchy is about speaking truth to power, changing power, protecting those that dare speak the truth to power.
May I support this position 100%? I think you're absolutely right. I think that's one of the big things that we do every day, that it should be at the top of the priority and is not. Very often we are accused, when we talk about human rights, that the West visits different places and tells people what to do and how to do it. And the biggest problem that human rights defenders all over the world tell me they have is that they are incapable. They're capable of talking to us, but they're incapable of talking to the government or to the local societies, because they demonize them, they don't want to listen to them, they don't have the culture. When we manage to create spaces where governments and civil society can get together and talk to each other, that often is a revelation in many countries. And that allows also for the malign attempt to westernize or politicize human rights allows it to just disappear. Because when people listen from their own girls the problems they have with the bathroom, they know that you're not saying it and I'm not saying it. They are saying it. And very often they never have this chance unless we use our gravitas to open those spaces.
Okay, I'm good. I want to hear from Ola, but I'm just being the devil's advocate, because if you just by analogy, we have big landowners and landless laborers. So I tell you what, we'll put them all in the same room together, and then suddenly the landowners will realize how badly they behaved and they will give the land to the landless laborers. I mean, that's not how it works in that context. And I can think of a number of other parallels we could make. So I want to come back to this issue a bit.
No, which is why you need the laws in addition to needing the mentality change.
So I think opening the space and then jamming the door open, probably. Ola.
Okay. So in speaking about amplifying girls' voices, one incident that comes to mind was when I was 8 years old. I heard someone telling my mom, watch her, she's too vocal for a girl. As I speak here today with such powerful gender equality crusaders, I'm so happy that my mom did not accept that advice, and she let me talk as much as I wanted. But the thing is, unfortunately, many girls in my community are not being socialized to own their own voices. And I guess that's where it begins, you know. For instance, I found out that my community in Lagos has the highest rate of sexual violence against adolescent girls. And what was more shocking was that nobody was listening to these girls. The media was only interested in speaking to them when they had been violated, and the sensational headlines would sell more papers. And even grassroots organizations are not making it a priority for girls to actually impute on designing of advocacy strategies and programs against, for the prevention of sexual violence. And this was a really big issue for me because I believe that girls should always be heard and not just seen, like she said. Especially when it has to do with their rights and well-being, they should be at the center of it as a matter of right and not privilege. Yes, it's not easy, but it is doable. That is why I founded my organization, actually, because I'm interested in grooming a dynamic generation of young feminists at the grassroots, where it matters most, so they can continue to drive the young feminist movement. Last year, my organization was able to bring 270 adolescent girls together, and we recruited these girls from local schools, no previous knowledge about policy, and together, after a series of meetings after school, simple meetings in their classrooms, they were able to draft for my community, Ali Mosho, that has 2 million inhabitants. They were able to draft an action plan for the prevention of sexual violence. And this action plan has been adopted by our local government. We took this action plan, thank you. We took this action plan to the traditional and religious leaders, about 1,500 of them. I can never forget the shock on their faces when they got to see the kind of solutions that girls between 10 and 16 years old were preferring for ending sexual violence. So I think I learned 3 lessons from this process. First, it has to be a community approach. From families to faith leaders, we all have to be intentional about including girls' voices. It has to be normalized that girls are speaking in the room. And then again, we have to make them understand that gender equality and feminism are not adult terms. We have to reach them before patriarchy does, so that we can change this for generations to come. I believe so much in this solution that adolescent girls have, and they have proved times without number that girls can actually make gender policy and not just soup.
Very good, thank you. Just before we move on, Ola, without reading out the entire action plan, just give us 2 or 3 highlights of the things that most needed action or most surprised you.
Okay, so I never knew that in religious spaces, there was no sort of gender balance when it comes to watching the kids. So I found out from the girls that most times, the religious leaders assign only male teachers, male supervisors to supervise both boys and girls. We're talking about children between 0 to 16 years, basically. So sometimes the men have to take the children to the toilets unsupervised. And this is when, some girls begin to experience some kind of violations and, get, molested. And it was going on, and parents, were not giving it a thought. It was that little. And then even in our communities, down to the hoodlums who were hanging around, I actually realized that some of these boys would, catcall the girls, and when they don't, accept, they'll just go and hit their bum, hit their breasts, and that's how this happens. And nobody says anything until it is now full-blown rape, and very little can be done at that time.
Very good. And the religious leaders were shocked, and then what did they do on Monday morning, kind of thing? Did they change?
Yes. Actually, I know one religious leader that introduced a gender balance, that started having both a male and a female teacher for the kids.
Very good. Okay, thank you. We're going to hear a bit more about bottom-up and top-down from two of Plan's kind of local campaigners who are Scarlett Karoleva and Laura Begshoff.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scarlett, and this is Laura, and we're youth lobbyists at the Plan Netherlands. What we do is that we provide advice for policymakers, and we're also having dialogue with The Hague and companies. We all have our reasons why we're here. I was raised by the strongest woman that I know, my darling mother Larissa, and she showed me what it means to be a strong woman. With that, she inspires me to help those who are in a disadvantaged position. Well, we had some very good points that are already told by the panel, which means that we are having very good points, and we're going to repeat them again, starting with the bottom-up theory. If we really want to ensure that we provide that the victims of inequality are the ones who are leading the movement, we need to start with the power of victims. We need to train these role models so that they can empower other women, they can raise awareness, and inspire others. To do this as effective as possible, we need to start at a grassroots movement. And last but not least, we cannot forget about men. If we really want to make a change, we have to include men as well and view this problem from their perspective as well. Because otherwise we're just gonna have a movement full of powerful women, but is it really gonna make a change? We cannot forget that men are also victims of inequality. Suicide rates are much higher for men than for women. And why? Because we have the stereotype that women can talk about their feelings, but men cannot. This results in them keeping their feelings to themselves instead of seeking out for help or support, leading to higher suicide rates. And we need change. We need change, not just for women, but also for men. So if we would work together, men and women, include everyone, we can make toxic masculinity disappear and thereby also equate the position of women.
Thank you. Well, in addition to this bottom-up theory, to me as a filmmaker, I think it's the most interesting challenge, but also my responsibility to give a voice to girls that are impacted the most by gender-based violence. Media has the power to enlighten different perspectives, but we should stop othering. I mean that we should stop looking at others from our own Western perspective only. Instead, media has the power to share voices in equality. And also, media is created by people, and media influences the way we look at men and women. So I think it's up to the next generation of filmmakers to be critical against stereotyping and create more female heroes, but also collaborating male and female leaders. Like, for example, Star Wars. And speaking about collaborating, we are from the Girls' White Watch, and we are all different kinds of people. Like Scarlett and I, we have different study background, different political views, but we still work together despite of those differences. So if we can, why can't you?
And if you disagree, please come and join us and visit us at the stand 83. We would love to have a conversation, and we look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Very good. I've got two more speakers from the floor, but let me just pause a minute and just think, where have we got to? Having heard people speak, are you optimistic? Let's start with you. Are you optimistic or pessimistic? And you know, your appeal at the beginning was, we can help these activists, but it has to be funded. Why hasn't it been funded, and what do we have to do to change that?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I have to say that I feel very optimistic, and I know that Frida feels very optimistic. because we know that there is work happening on the ground, even if it's made invisible by patriarchy and by other forces. Like, we talk about dismantling patriarchy, we talk about transformative changes in transforming societies, but people are working on that every single day, and these people are young feminists and trans youth, and we can't forget them, and we can't make them to be invisible. Yes, it's important to talk about men, but also men have a lot of spaces that they already have access to, and they need to figure out a way that they can themselves go to these spaces and turn these spaces feminist without taking the floor from young women and from trans youth. And I do emphasize trans youth as Frida, because, you know, we have to break the binary. If we really want to break patriarchy, we have to move forward and stop thinking of just men and women and think about everybody else. So think about gender nonconforming folks and think about trans folks who are really pushing the feminist agenda forward. So yes, because of their tireless work, I feel very, very optimistic. Frida, currently we're funding about 200 groups, and that's a total of $2 million that we've given in the past 6 years. And that's just us, a small group of young feminists under 30 gathering together. So imagine, you know, what the NGOs and the NGOs and the UN agencies and the governments who have even more budgets, what they can actually achieve if you take your money and you rethink your relationship to it and actually trust the young feminists on the ground. So find them and fund them, because we're here. You know, and I think I can't say that enough, that maybe, you know, we don't have the structures that you're used to in terms of hierarchy, because we're usually very horizontal. Maybe we don't have the fancy MNE, you know, frameworks and tick boxes that we have to fill out to access these grants, but we're still doing the work and we're there. So maybe my appeal is to all of you and to all of you in the ground to rethink the way that you're moving money around the world, and think to yourself, why isn't that money ending up in the hands of the grassroots communities, the ones who are actually doing the work day to day and putting their lives on the line, because these are groups who are at risk, but they're there on the ground making sure that the society can be better for them and for the people that comes after them.
Do you have a view on this civil society space shrinking question?
It is shrinking. It is shrinking, but I don't think it's going to disappear because we're fighting for it. It's not going down without a fight, that's for sure. But we're also trying to create alternative spaces and make sure that these are seen also as very valuable. There's a lot of civil society events, there's a lot of gatherings and convenings, and there's so much that comes out of that. I think Frida also has a report on that. So do check it out. But the beauty of feminists and youth groups gathering together, and the beauty that comes out of it, like he said, when you had all of your young people, and beautiful story. So yes,
okay.
The space is shrinking, but not without a fight. It's not going down, no.
I have a question for Stavros and Michele, which is that I became, in 1981, I became a fellow of the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex, where some of the great titans of gender studies in development were working. Christine White, Kate Young, Naila Kabir. They all went off to the women's conference. Was it Cairo? Where was the women's conference? Beijing, was it? Yeah. And that was in the 1980s, I guess.
90s.
Caroline, was it? Okay, but I think there were some earlier conferences as well. Anyway, the bottom line is, if you'd asked me in 1980, let's say 1982, it took me a year to catch up. You know, what do I think about women's voices? And I would say, well, it's a patriarchy, it's about men as well as women. And we had a course at Sussex called Men, Women and Development. And it was about gender. Voices, bottom-up, participation. And here we are, 37 years later, still making the same points. So, explain to me what's going on.
Well, okay. You have very valid points, I have to say, I agree. I have one, not objection, but one concern in the way many discussions about human rights develop these days. We focus a lot, and we should, on the challenges, but we tend to, therefore, cloud away the fact that there's a tremendous amount of progress that has been achieved precisely because many women's voices in the past 30 years have been effective. Now, last year, Tunisia passed one of the most advanced violence against women's laws that exist, looking from prevention to helping the victims. Who knows about that? Jordan and Lebanon passed laws for the first time that forbid rape rapists from escaping punishment because they marry their victims. A very widespread practice. Who has heard about that? These are remarkable things that are being done, in my view, very effectively. Now, will men, especially in deeply patriarchal societies, be happy with women's voices, even when they actually achieve change in the end? In some instances, no. Look at Saudi Arabia and driving. Women activists for decades have been fighting for women to drive in Saudi Arabia, and they succeeded. They succeeded. It wasn't us saying you have to do it. They on the ground, they managed to change hearts and minds there. They managed to put pressure. Eventually this was announced, but guess what? A few weeks ago they started being arrested because, well, it shouldn't be too obvious that it was those women who achieved that, right? In China, women organized against violence against women. When I was in China, I made a point of meeting with those women that were arrested subsequently by a government that claimed that fighting violence against women was its priority. Except it should be the government taking the credit, not those women fighting for it, right? So a tremendous amount of success has happened in the past years and decades. I am optimistic because of that. I am optimistic because I see discussions like this focusing on stuff we weren't talking about before. How to open the spaces for discussion that doesn't simply include the wise, Westerner and the government, but people themselves. Where's the filmmaker? She left. Let me just close with this. I was in Pakistan.
Briefly, Stavros.
Very briefly. I was in Pakistan 2 years ago, official visit. Told by everyone, laws to protect women and equality, perfect. Very, very good. Except not applied because there's an issue of patriarchal mentalities. Okay, I said, fine. So I told our diplomats, I want to meet with soap opera producers and actresses and actors. Now, if you ask any embassy to get you a minister, they can do it. You ask them, get me soap opera actors? Panic ensued, right? I arrived, they managed to find a few. We got together. This is a story that stuck in my mind. I talked to them, I said, look, everyone watches you, no one cares what I talk about. What's happening with women's rights in your shows? And the one thing I recall one actress telling me is, 3 years ago, here's how the show ends. A husband gets back home at night, he's extremely pissed off with his life, with his work. The wife is there, he beats her up, she falls on the floor, she cries. And she says, today, here's how the show ends. There's an extra scene. She falls on the floor, she cries, then she gets up, she calls up her friend and says, this bastard beat me up again. We're not yet at the scene where she goes to court and the bastard goes to court and he's in jail. We're not there yet. But we understand how it is as politicians that we have to work on these topics that go way beyond having a good punchline in a panel like this, that goes to touching people's lives on the ground, and that's what we do. That's what listening to me at least means. You have to listen to women on what they like and what they need, not what you assume they do, and how they think it can be achieved, not how you think it can be achieved.
Very good. I thought you were going to say the last scene while she stands up and thumps him.
That would be nice.
That would be good too. Michele.
I think what's going on is that, voice is power. It is power of making decisions, it is power of influencing decisions, and in the past 37 years, I think we've been taking a number of steps forward, sometimes breakthrough steps, sometimes very painful steps, and a number of steps backwards. So this is why we're still discussing about these issues, because power structures by and large, at all levels you look at them, public institutions at a global, international, regional, national level, local level, business sectors, power structures are primarily held by men. And you know very well, when you have power, you don't give it out power very easily. So this is why we're still discussing these issues. And this is why I think we have to focus on two strategies. On one hand, we have to be able to, work to protect all of the step forwards that we've been able to make, and we have been able to make progress over the past 37 years. But also we have to find ways to accelerate, to create much more critical mass, to make sure that there are many more women that actually have voice and that have power, that come into position of power so that they can use their voice to make decisions, and also something that we haven't really touched upon, today, and maybe we can come back later, using their voice and their power to allocate resources, which are actually changing women's lives.
Okay. I'm going to come to you in a second, AB, about culture, but before I do that, can I call on Caroline Harper from ODI, because you haven't been in this game as long as I have, but you have some history, I think.
That's very kind of you, Simon. I think I may have almost been in the game as long as you. But Caroline Harper from Overseas Development Institute in London. I'm really glad that somebody early on introduced the term patriarchy, the lady over here, because then everybody started using it. And patriarchy, power, and the long view are all issues really close to my heart. And I think are really essential when we're looking at the issue of change. Of course, women have voices, but they also need platforms by which to exert their influence and to be listened to. And what I wanted to just mention and draw your attention to do today were really what these barriers of patriarchy are and what they look like and how they change sustainably. So for me, they're the formal and the informal laws and the attitudes and behaviors which relegate women and girls to second place. They're often invisible, and they operate in day-to-day life, and they're alive and well absolutely everywhere. And we have to call them out. And we have to make them visible. But I think huge progress has been made over the last 37 years. But because we have to have this long view, and because it's patriarchy, we need another 50, 100 years and more before this is going to change properly. But we have made fantastic steps, I think, especially recently, and we're at another tipping point. The suffragettes, we're at a tipping point. We're at another tipping point now. And we have to make sure that these changes are sustainable. So I wanted to call out a couple. And this is in my own country, and this is from the Guardian newspaper last week, and some of you may have read this. These are the reasons given by a range of chief executives and chairs of the top 350 companies for not appointing more women directors. I don't think women fit comfortably into the board environment. All the good women have already been snapped up. We have one woman already on the board, so we're done. Many women don't want the hassle or pressure of sitting on a board. There aren't that many women with the right credentials and depth of experience to sit on the board. This is a survey done this year, 2018. This is patriarchy in action in institutional structures. And this is what we face in terms of changing. But we will change it because the women executives, in response, have made some very, very good response to these comments, including, well, you know, what about all the mediocre men that sit on boards? Why don't we have some mediocre women sitting on boards as well? I mean, they want to get real with this issue. So I want to draw your attention to a platform that we're running called the alignplatform.org. It's alignplatform.org, and it's on gender norms and how they change.
Spell Align, Caroline.
ALIGN, platform.org. And we are bringing together the best of evidence about how gender norms change sustainably. And that is how not just attitudes but behaviors change. You can express an attitude like, I don't think it's right to beat women, and then you can go home and beat your wife. How do behaviors change? We're bringing together the best of evidence from behavioral scientists, from anthropologists, from sociologists, all of whom are working on what you might call culture or what you might call behavior, and how those behaviors change in education, in health, in economic empowerment, in violence, and with an eye to intersectionality as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I've very much enjoyed the panel and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks very much. Align Platform. alignplatform.what.org. Very good. AB, I wanted to come back to you on some of this, because one of the things you don't shy away from in the report, which is in the middle of that, that three on the screen, is culture. And culture varies from one country to another. I was moderating a session on gender budgeting earlier on, and somebody an African woman talked about the mindset of African men. And we shouldn't shy away from the fact that also some countries in the Middle East, for example, are famously not as sympathetic to women as some other countries, to put it mildly, and as the driving license issue illustrated. So you looked at that in your study, and what do you conclude?
I
think maybe sort of before diving into the report, the main thing to hold on to is there are no static cultures. Cultures change all the time, every day. Behaviors, tastes, preferences. I mean, we have a fantastic example here in Europe. Look at what has happened in Ireland in the last 5 years. I mean, talk about culture shifts and culture change. Look at what happens in villages across Togo that stand together and stand up and end the practice of female genital mutilation that has happened for thousands of years. Culture changes. So yes, there are some cultures that are at one stage or another stage, etc. But the notion that culture is something that we have to be afraid of, or culture is by nature the main barrier to change, is complete and utter nonsense. It is the invisibility, the lack of dialogue, the lack of recognizing the lived realities of people that experience those cultures, and the lack of conversation, mainly intergenerational, around various aspects of cultural practices that prevents culture from changing, or at least makes it slower. So I think that is a key point. And you asked this issue about, so what about the rich landowners and the landless? Just get them in the room together and have them chat. Now, most of those are men anyway, and men don't necessarily, they know each other's reality. I mean, I can bet you the rich landowner knows exactly the reality of the poor landowner. Well, they at least have some idea. I wanted to talk to the issue of invisibility. What we know today is that basically every indicator in development, so the wonderful institutions around the world, etc., that have been collecting data on development progress, etc., most of that data is absolutely invisible of the lived reality of the girl child. If you look at the global legislative framework, the Human Rights Convention, CEDAW, even the Convention on the Rights of Children. We have just done a study which is posted on something called the Girls' Rights Platform of 1,300 international rules and conventions governing human rights. The only place where the girl child is mentioned, the only place out of every single convention is around education. Nothing else. She's totally invisible in every treaty, convention, rights, resolution that governs.
CRC, even in the...
CRC is gender blind. Yeah. CEDAW is age blind. You've got a whole body of legislation out there. Now, of course, it doesn't say, exclude the girl child. But because we haven't been deliberate about collecting information, data that is truly gender and age disaggregated, because we haven't specifically mentioned it, the system has kept everybody away from the realities of the girl child. So when the reason why we believe putting the lived reality of the girl child and young women face to face with people that make policy decisions, let's also remember that only 20% of mayors and councillors in the world are women. So most of them don't get up every day and think about the realities of menstrual hygiene or sexual harassment on the street. So unless that dialogue is happening, and that is the power and the voice that needs to happen, things will not move. Am I an optimist? Absolutely, because crikey, when those girls stand in those boardrooms, when they sit in front of the councillors, when they talk to the Transport Commissioner of Delhi about making sure that buses are safe for girls, they're listened to, because that reality is so unknown, despite the occasional media blip. The lived realities of the girl child is the one that will at least help fuel the next generation of change, because I completely obviously agree with everybody else that a lot of change has happened, but the next generation of change around equality will happen through making sure that some of that intergenerational dialogue happens.
Okay, thank you. Ola, a quick word from you on whether you're optimistic or not, and then I want to hear from Nidhi Goyal in the audience, and then I want to have more participation from people in the floor, and then we'll come back to the panel before we finish. So Ola, optimistic or pessimistic?
Okay, I'm definitely optimistic. You know, it might not look so rosy at the moment, because we know, like for Nigeria, where I come from, there are not really, like the legal barriers to gender equality are not so many. Most of the time, we have laws that protect women and girls. So for instance, there was a landmark decision made by the Supreme Court that the culture that women and girls basically could not inherit land from their fathers, from their deceased fathers. The Supreme Court declared it void and against the rule of law. But in the communities, when you go down to the communities, people still have a hard time accepting that the boy child and the girl child should inherit property. So there's a disconnect between laws and policies evolving and norms in the community. So I feel like that is where we need to focus strongly at the grassroots, because it is this norm change that can sustain equality at the end of the day. We cannot afford to just look at it from the angle of laws alone and policies alone. We have to be intentional about norm change. We can't leave it to chance. So norm change definitely takes time, and I know that we're not where we were 50 years ago. It takes time, and it just takes all of us in this room and those outside to join us and keep including girls' voices in this norm change.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that question in a bit more detail, but Nidhi Goyal first, speaking partly or anything else you like, but people with disabilities.
Okay, thank you so much. We've been discussing about invisibility, we're talking about attitudes and norms, and so attitudes and assumptions and norms bring about another level of invisibility. I'd like to begin with, we're talking about building voices, amplifying voices, challenging patriarchy. But just a short example here. There was a funder I was engaging with who funded work around violence against women and prevention measures, solutions, legal advocacy, etc. And so I presented all the kind of violence that women and girls with disabilities face. And the response was, this is great, I had no idea about this. Now can we talk about real women?
Oh my gosh.
And so who's really included in the conversation of women and girls? And where is that invisibility stemming from? It's in law, it's in policy, it's in numbers, it's across the board. And then when there is such a heavy level of invisibility, we're talking about amplifying voices, but maybe we want to step back and say, build the voices where women with disabilities lack the agency. They do not have the right to make decisions. They do not have a voice, in short. They're really investing in right from education, but really building the idea of selfhood with women and girls with disabilities would be extremely important. Treating them through a rights lens and not sort of a welfare lens of really treating them as equal citizens, demographic dividend, as important as other women. So really bringing that intersection and inclusion would be very important. And their voices, when we say are being amplified, we need to ensure that all women are speaking for themselves and not someone else speaking on their behalf, no matter how much they may struggle with the literal concept of speech. One thing that I'd like to sort of highlight here, very directly linked to something that we were discussing around patriarchy, is that we're talking about power structures. And so maybe we should broaden with the multiple intersections that we want to address of race, of culture, of ethnicity, of disability, that what are the power structures we're actually trying to tackle? Is it only the men? Is it really the male power structure? Is it patriarchy in the sense that we understand? Or does this patriarchy include not only sexism, but it also includes ableism? It would also include racism. So what is the patriarchy that we're breaking down? I'd like to sort of close with something that one of our panelists said, is about normalization. The more we normalize intersections, the more we normalize that there are diverse voices, and those voices would have to be built and amplified. The more we normalize that any kind of diversity is not abnormal, and everyone has the right to have a voice, I think it'll be a huge step forward for empowerment. The opportunity, I feel optimistic because there is a huge opportunity at this point to do an intentional inclusion. So when we say girls' and women's voices need to be included, it won't just happen. We're intentionally doing it. So if we just expand this intentional inclusion and say, are the diverse voices of women and girls being included, that would really promise a better future for all our women and girls and ensure that we're not leaving anyone behind. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Is it possible to have the lights up so that I can see people? And perhaps it doesn't matter if you, that's better. Let's take, it's nearly 15:15. Let's just take 6 or 7 minutes, give 3 or 4 of you a chance, stand up, say who you are, contribute, and sit down again. You first, sir, you had your hand up first, and then you, and then anybody else who wants to come in.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. Well, why don't you go first, and then the chap over there.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Randa Yasser. I'm from Lebanon. I work as an international expert with most of the international organizations working here. I have an issue always since I work right now as an advisor to the Minister of Women Affairs in Lebanon regarding the relationship between the governmental organizations, the ministries, or the bodies that work on women and gender issues, and the CSOs and NGOs. And every time we'll think about how we can make the voices of the women, young women, the girls heard, and we know that they are directly beneficiaries or they are directly connected through the NGOs, while we have the government that wants to be in power and they want to design the policies and they want to work and know, maybe they don't have the knowledge, maybe they are not exposed to this learning process that NGOs have. So this is the gap. So I don't have the bridge that's really communicating between CSOs and between the governmental organizations. Yet I have just the contrary done by most of the organizations that provide donations and provide funds. They make the governmental organization like the enemy of the CSOs and the NGOs. They keep them apart. I don't know how. But once these projects are linking both governmental organizations with the NGOs, we can find a better process in making the voices of the beneficiaries heard by the government through the NGOs, and it makes policy making more concrete and based on good practices that the NGOs are exposed to through these conventions to learn more and to have better policies learned, and to the government of their countries where they can really design better policies that sustain the change on the gender equality level and make the people heard.
Good.
So how can we really strengthen more the relationship between the NGOs, the coalition of NGOs working on certain issues, and the policymakers? Thank you.
Thank you. I should have said 60 seconds because we're running out of time, but you, sir, and then you, madam, and then we'll see where we are.
Yes, thank you, sir. My name is Jean-Jacques Schul from ID International. 52 years of experience in development financing, and ID International is a network of 600 organizations. It's a very, I'm sorry, a pity that we get the word so late in the game to answer the critical questions which you really asked. And you were quite right. How come that since 40 years now, we are discussing the same thing and we have the impression of the cat trying to catch its tail, and the situation does not change? I mean, just 3 facts. Today, the UNESCO said that a poor girl in a rural area has simply no chance of completing primary education. And they give the percentage. In our network, we just got a letter for this event. They said from Guinea, in the forest area of Guinea, 6% of girls succeed in completing primary education. Northwestern Uganda, it's less than 10%. So let's stop talking here, and let's stop giving the word to people who have been in this business for so many years and have not succeeded in doing what is it. What is the name that we receive from our members? Women, African women, are in socio-economic slavery. Let's use the word. That's the situation in which they are. And perhaps if we use that word, maybe that will change things. And so how can we overcome the change? And I think the lady who just took the word is very right. It's the local civil society, not the organizations that take 80 years to find a solution. We have the big, it's anyway, stop foreign aid. That's what they tell us. If you stop foreign aid, the government will have to listen to us. Sorry to register. And if you don't believe me, come tomorrow to the lab debate at 1 o'clock, where we'll show why this is so important. Thank you very much. And Sussex University is entirely in line with that thought. Thank you.
May I just, before we go on, may I just say, do you take any responsibility for the fact that you have been in this business 22 years and things haven't changed? Or is it only the mistake of people in government?
Well, if I can answer that question, that accusations...
Order. I'm sorry, listen.
No, don't answer me. Answer it within the organization.
Yes, I will. I created that organization when I took my retirement in order to correct all the mistakes that I did with the World Bank and the European Development Bank, with Plan and all the other big NGOs.
Stop.
Thank you.
Lady there, please be really quick.
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Natalie. I'm one of the EDD young leaders from Kenya. And my challenge, my organization is one of the beneficiaries of the Frida Young Feminist Fund. Woo! And the one thing that they showed us is that you can trust the people who understand what's happening in the communities. And what I want to challenge UN and Plan is that trust us. We already proven, Ola has already proven that she can bring more than 200 girls together, and together they're making things happen. So use the structures that are there, and please support the work that is already happening, because young people are leading the change and you're making the difference in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will give you the chance to come back in a second. I want to give the panel the last word, but let's just summarize where we've got to. We started out by saying there are huge gender disparities still, but if Hans Rosling were here, and sadly he's died, but you should read his book, just published, which makes the case very strongly that in lots of ways things are getting better. So a number of you made that point. And if you look at, for example, girls' primary education rates now, they are only a few percentage points below where men are. Of course, quality of education and so on is another matter. So we don't ignore the progress that has been made, but there is a lot to do. Women's voices, yes, and we've heard some really inspiring examples of bringing young girls and women together and articulating need and, in some respects, making change. But I still think we've got an issue around power, around patriarchy, about whether chatting is enough, talking is enough. How do we actually use the legal framework in countries where perhaps there isn't the respect for human rights and where civil society space is shrinking? How do we change culture more quickly than it might otherwise change? And we have to recognize that sometimes culture is a major barrier to women's empowerment. So let me just take a quick vote. First of all, put your hands up if you agree with these statements, just so we get them for the minutes, if you like. Do you agree that we've made some progress in the last 40 years? Hands up if you think we have. Hands up if you think there is still a lot to do. Yes, good. Hands up if you think that dialogue will do it on its own. In other words, that talking is going to deliver the change in culture. Okay, so it won't. Hands up if you think that just better education through the system, starting with very young children, boys as well as girls, will eventually change the norms. Some of you, but not all of you. Hands up if you think we also, in combination, need strong top-down application of legal measures in order to make sure change is faster. So not everybody, but quite a few of you. I think the question for you, and we have 7 minutes, which gives you about a minute each, and we always promise to finish on time in these sessions. The question for you is, what's next? What's next to take this from the level of a debate at the European Development Days into real change on the ground? And Sophia, we'll start with you.
Okay, great, thank you. So Frida stands for flexibility, resources, inclusivity, diversity, and action. And we really try to embody at every level those concepts. And for what's next, I really hope that everybody will continue to do so, or change and adopt that. Like you mentioned, thank you so much for bringing in the multiple oppressions, because it's true that dismantling patriarchy is not enough, because then if you continue to have the oppressive systems of capitalism, of racism, of classism, of ableism, of homophobia, of transphobia, et cetera, then you're only pushing the voices of some women and not the others, and we're not going to get far with that at all. Right? We agree? Yeah? Okay, good. Great. So now that we all agree, what do we do about it? I think we have to look at ourselves. I think we have to look at our organizations and make sure that within us, we're also creating the change that we're asking the local communities to do. Because with Frida, with Frida, we are funders. So we're really in the background. What we do is let the young feminists lead. And that's my challenge to all of you. Let them lead, because they know, they have the know-how, they have everything. They just need that extra push and that money. So take your money and give it to the girls, give it to the trans youth. Challenge the power structure, challenge your relationship with money and your relationship with how you monitor, how you evaluate, listen to the stories, but also give them the space to do so. And sometimes that means giving up your seat and saying, okay, now it's not my time anymore, or now I need to shut up and take a step back and let others do what they have to do. And it's a challenge, but you have to make that commitment with yourself first before you can expect it to see change in society.
Very good, thank you. If you would like to say anything about the end of it.
No.
Just Stavros, one thing I'd like you to just address, which we haven't really dealt with, is what do we have to do to enforce the rule of human rights law in the worst offending countries?
We have to be extremely vigilant publicly to expose violations, especially when countries are ideologically or politically committed against rights, because they don't want to change. So we're going to make life as miserable as possible for them until they do. And for countries who are not committed against rights, but are violating them for a number of reasons, including perhaps cultural capacity lacking, we have to, through quiet diplomacy and persuasion, and also through supporting both the government up there and the grassroots down here, bring the change from within, not from without. The EU is the absolutely biggest funder of grassroots organizations, including and particularly feminist women's organizations in the world. No one comes close to us. And I think you're absolutely right to point out that we need to be smarter in how we identify who can actually get access. Very often it is capitals-based organizations, because they're easy to reach out to, or organizations who speak good English, because we speak good English. But many people get lost in this process because they are in the corners of countries, etc., etc. Final point I want to make: if we're going to listen to voices, women's and men's, I think if we're going to be avoiding the problems we're seeing today politically in the world, we need to open up those doors to all voices. We need to understand exactly what's happening. We're talking about changing mentalities of boys. Is everyone in this panel who follows this issue convinced that women's mentalities on women's rights are in fact reflective entirely of what you just said? Or what you just said? Because I have listened to, in my visits, to women who tell me very different things. Perhaps influenced by patriarchy themselves, perhaps influenced by, perhaps truly believing in religious or other things, doesn't matter. Where are these women in this room? Why haven't we heard from someone who says, I entirely disagree with you? Unless we really listen and address this issue at all different levels, we're in a danger of being an echo chamber of our own creation, which is not bad, mind you. When you're in a battle, including in a cultural battle, you'd better know who your allies are and team together to punch away the bad forces. But still, if you're going to be making the long-term change, there's going to be some much deeper discussions happening than what happened in this room right now.
we locked them all up. We didn't let them in.
Yes, I understand.
Mikova, we have 4 minutes.
Very quickly. Yeah. In terms of next steps, two key things. First is to put much more women in positions of power at all levels, in political institutions and economic structures, in economic institutions. But also, one other thing that we need to do is we need to continue to support platforms so that women can actually have voice. And going back to the point that was earlier made, and I think that if we just take a walk outside in this venue, we can see hundreds of examples of how, through various interventions, women have been given a platform to actually be heard. Earlier today, I was listening about the Deputy Minister of Canada referring that for the first time within the G7 ministerial meeting of development ministers, there were actually a group of young women that were officially invited to the G7 ministerial meeting of development to speak about issues of reproductive rights, which is kind of a breakthrough. But without going at that higher level, if we also go at the community level, platform is about very small self-help groups that can actually give women a possibility of getting out of the house and discussing common issues and trying to see how they can actually emancipate themselves and empower themselves. One final note in terms of sort of community structures. UN Women has been supporting, I was speaking about allocation of resources previously. UN Women has been for years supporting governments at national and local level on the issue of gender-responsive budgeting, which is very simply put about how do you make sure that public resource allocation is made in a way that is responsive to the differential needs of men and women. So one critical element of that, of course, is understanding through data and analysis how do you actually make choices on resources, but the other key thing is to actually create local community watchdogs. That can actually, which is made basically of women groups, which can actually make sure that they put pressure on local authorities, they can actually show data, they can actually request that they go at the table and contribute to those decisions, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. Amy.
So I'll be totally non-defensive and say we embrace all the challenges that we've gotten. So let me give the floor to my colleague that I wholly trust will speak the truth to all of us.
Okay, so I think what's next for all of us is self-evaluation. I really respect Chimamanda Adichie a lot, and there's something she says, beware of feminism light. But today, I'm going to re-quote her and say, beware of inclusion light, where you include girls at certain points, when it's convenient for you, and at other times, you take them out of the room. And that applies to, all kinds of women and girls. Let's be inclusive to the letter. Let's be comfortable with relinquishing some of our power to others. Thank you.
I think there is nothing to add to that. We've had a really focused discussion. I hope we've made some progress. I hope we've tackled some of the difficult issues. I'd like to thank you in the audience, the speakers in the front row, but especially join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.
Simon, can we thank you as well? I mean, this was one of the most excitingly conducted discussions that have been in a while. Thank you for making this.